I think I should make a little disclaimer right now about introductions. There's bios of everybody. Do you all have bios of all the speakers in front? Good, because as you can read, our panelists and 3 of our 4 moderators today are so accomplished that giving full introductions would probably eat up the entire day, and then we wouldn't have time to talk about anything. So we will introduce our panelists a little bit and give you a little context of who these folks are, but they're going to be, unfortunately, truncated introductions for the purpose of diving into our program. And on that note, you've already heard about Tony Romanucci. Tony is a fellow plaintiff's personal injury trial lawyer. He's had great success in various aspects of trial practice. But for our purposes today, Tony has a great deal of experience prosecuting and a great deal of success with police brutality cases. And he's the chair of the Police Misconduct Litigation Group for the American Association of Justice. And it was from that perspective that Tony came up with the idea that the relationship between law enforcement and the community might be a source of the problem and wanted to address it. And so with that, and to focus on that topic, please welcome Tony Romanucci. And perhaps we should also ask if Tony's panel members could maybe come up here and get seated. So thanks.
Good morning, everyone. And as our panel is stepping up, I'd like to say just a few words, and we will be very respectful of your time. You know, the first thing is how humbling it is to see that this issue seems to be as important as it is, because the room is filled, and I believe that we all want to see this issue in Chicago solved. I can't help but thank enough Dan Coton, Terry Murphy, Judge Mulroy, I'm not sure where you're sitting, the committee that we worked with, because it was such a selfless committee that we worked with to get this done in 3 months. It was almost an impossible task, but nobody had an agenda, nobody had an ego when we were doing this, and it was all to do one thing, and that's to serve you. That's to serve the community and make sure that what we come up with today, as Dan said, is not a blame game, but we want to, as much as possible with this esteemed panel and the ones that follow, is to find answers to this issue. As I went around the room this morning meeting people, I really realized that although the Chicago Bar Association is the 900-pound elephant in the room, the one that has 20,000 plus members, this is not a lawyer issue. This is really a people issue. And that's what we're going to do. As the big lawyer group, we want to make this into a solvable people issue, because we're people too, and we live in this city and we love this city, and that's why I'm up here. As Dan said, I have experience in litigating cases, you know, against the police, but I find it horrific. I really do. I mean, I think this is something that I don't want to do anymore, and that's the way that I came up with the idea to stop it, because people were getting just unnecessarily killed because they either didn't know how to interact with police, or police didn't know how to interact with them. And that's how everything then just developed, as Dan and Terry told you. So I'm really, really excited to do this, because we live in this city. And if we continue to lose population and erode our tax base, and it's awesome when we get announcements that Motorola and Google are filling up the merchandise mart, but for every job that we create there, we're probably losing 5 people out of the neighborhood who are just moving out. And our city's population keeps decreasing. It's not increasing. So we need to do something to make our city safe so that we can get people back into our city, not have them leave. The middle class is leaving our city, and those are the people that we need. I want to say one more thing before I start with our panel. I had a nice conversation with Pam Means and Alderman Sawyer last night when I was talking to them, and I got a little bit too passionate about kids, because not only do I love kids, and I have my own children, but I believe that all children should always be safe at all times. And I'm not saying this in a bad way, but to me it's offensive that our city was put in a position to put up signs in the neighborhoods that there's a safe passage for kids. There should be no signs any place in our city that should say it's safe for kids to be in, right? It's really offensive. Our kids should be safe to be anywhere, anytime that they want to be. And that's our goal. Pull the signs down. Let's make it safe for all kids in all places at all times, not just for a certain street or certain hours because they're going to school. That's the goal here, folks. If we get there, CBA can do something about this, we will be so successful. We'll make an imprint on this city. So, Pam, I want to start with you, and I welcome Kim Foxx, our state's attorney, and also Superintendent Eddie Johnson. Superintendent, you are looking great. Can we know who your nutritionist is, please? Thank you. I mean, you really do, and thank you for being here. And I know that you have other commitments this morning, and we'll do our best to respect. You raise your hand when you need, give us 5 minutes when you're ready to go. Thank you. Pam, I want to start with you. Pam was the president of the National Bar Association at one time, and she was president of the National Bar Association during one of the most turbulent times in our nation's recent history. Pam was president of the NBA during the unrest that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri. And that was when, as most of you know, Michael Brown was shot and killed, and Pam, who also happens to be from the St. Louis area, was president of the NBA. So Pam, I want to ask you, as president of the NBA and actually living in St. Louis, what is it that you learned during that time about our communities and how they regard law enforcement? Looking forward, so it's a two-part question, what did you learn? And then looking forward, how do we improve even more with what you've learned?
Thank you so much, Tony. You know, I learned 4 things, and I'm gonna make it quick because I want to get to solutions. I learned that as a mother of a 14-year-old at the time, that it was very personal. That it could have been my son laying in the street for over 10 to 12 hours, and regardless of the fact that I lived on a golf course, my son could have been mistaken for someone who shouldn't have been there. So 1, I learned it had to be personal. Number 2, I learned that there is a historical distrust between police and between the communities of color, and in particular the African American community. Police officers have a job of protecting and serving, but oftentimes those within communities that look like me feel like the police is out to get them instead of protecting them. And so it's just like, you know, the spouse that cheats on another spouse. Even if you take the person back, no matter how much they stay, every time they walk out the door, something in your head is going, where you going, what are you doing? There's a sense of distrust. And so no matter how much you know the individual, because there is a historical distrust, there's a propensity to not believe that police are there to trust you. Number 3, and this one was critical, I learned that the problem between police and the community, and especially communities of color, is that we are afraid to deal with the elephant that's sitting in America's room. And that is to have a real, open, and a heart-wrenching conversation about race that makes individuals uncomfortable on both sides of the aisle. Because when you could have a white gentleman in South Carolina walk into a Walmart, upset the Walmart, take a cash register, lead the police on a high-speed chase, take the police gun, try to take it from them, and then only be tased. But you have an African American in Ohio who is actually standing, leaning on a toy gun from the store, talking on the telephone, and is shot in 0.06 seconds. That tells you we have a problem in policing. And so we have to deal with race. 4th, I'm done. I learned that this also stems from the fact, and this as lawyers we must get, It develops from a flawed legal system and a standard that was created by Tennessee versus Gardner, the U.S. Supreme Court case in 1985, that created this standard of what use of force is. And if we fail as lawyers to educate our community about why police officers are acquitted, and it's not just because they're white, it is because the legal standard is flawed, and that there must be radical legal reform on both the state, the local, and the federal level. And until that happens, we'll continue to have this conversation. That's what I learned.
Pam, thank you, and we're going to come back because we need to follow up on some of the things that you talked about, especially about the education issue. I next want to turn to Superintendent Johnson, and yesterday, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, no later than that, Superintendent, there were new policies that you had disclosed to the public for the first time on, I think they actually are new policies, is that correct?
Yeah, right.
So there are new policies, if you haven't heard, which are very important on use of force policies. And it's the first time that there's been a change within the CPD on the orders and directives on use of force in quite some time. And this is very significant. Now, there's going to be an issue to be discussed whether or not those policies went far enough, but the point is that we got some change. And that's a big, important step in how police deal with use of force. So Superintendent Johnson, given what Pam Means just said about Tennessee versus Garner, and that is the seminal Supreme Court case on the use of deadly force, tell me about your use of force policies and how you envision those new policies educating your officers to build trust in the community, and when do we get that back?
Okay, so the new use of force policy was rolled out a couple of days ago. It actually won't go into effect until we get all 12,000 plus officers trained up on it, because it's not fair to hold them accountable for that new policy and they haven't been trained. And speaking to that, I don't want to have one partner in a squad car and he's trained on a new policy and the other partner isn't, so they're operating under two different policies. That's setting them up for failure. So it's going to be, my hope is that the policy itself will be in effect sometime early next year. So what led to this was, listen, we recognize CPD needed to change the way we did business in some respects. And we do a lot of things quite well. And the simple fact is we did some things that weren't quite well. And that's just to be quite candid about it. So our new policy is actually more restrictive than state law. State law gives us the authority to, for example, use deadly force with a fleeing felon. And the question becomes in law enforcement, can you use deadly force or should you use deadly force? That's the question, that's the conundrum. Being a person that's been involved in a few shootings myself, I can tell you that most of the time it happens in a split second. So my challenge is to ensure that we give the officers the best training that we could possibly provide them, so if they get into that situation, they have the tools available to them to be able to distinguish if they should or should not use deadly force. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Prior to our new policy, if a felon, so let's just say, let's take a burglar, someone who committed burglary unlawful entry. That's a felon. If we went to apprehend that subject and he had no deadly weapon in his possession and he fled from us, state law actually gives us the authority to still use deadly force to bring him into custody. Now that's an example of can you or should you? So now we're telling the officers, if the person does not pose an immediate threat of imminent danger or great bodily harm to the officer, his partner, or somebody in the public, then we're answering the question for them. The answer is no, you should not use deadly force. And so, I think that we are heading down a new path with CPD because our policy highlights de-escalation techniques and the sanctity of life. So those two things are important because it's telling the public that we recognize everybody's life is valuable, from a police officer to a public official, or even to a person that's out there committing crime, because that person means something to the people that love them. And we have to understand that and respect that. Regardless of what they've done, that's still a human life. And to take that life, we shouldn't take lightly. You know, deadly force should absolutely be the last resort. And that's the main highlights of the new policy.
Well, Superintendent Johnson, I can't applaud you enough for telling us that, and I think this is something that we really need to get out into the community. But before you leave, I do want to ask you, though, do you believe that the use of force policies have gone far enough, and do you see whether or not the union contract that's coming up for negotiation is an impediment to the community in telling them that what CPD is doing, that they do want to bridge that gap of trust? Because you've taken that first step, which is extremely applaudable, but are we going far enough?
Well, as far as the use of force policy, my challenge is to make sure I protect the officers that are protecting us every day, and secondly, protect the public from unnecessary use of force, and that's a delicate balancing act. So I think with this new use of force policy, I think we've struck a good balance in protecting the officers and protecting the public. Because as I said before, you know, every life is valuable, and we should not dismiss the fact, even though someone may be committing a crime, we still shouldn't dismiss the fact that that life is still valuable, and we should only use deadly force if it's absolutely necessary. So I do think that we have created a policy that folks can digest, because I tell you, one of the amazing things with this policy, and I don't know a law enforcement agency in the country that's done this, certainly not in Chicago, where we put our policy out for public comment twice. Not once, but twice. That's never been done. We never even asked our rank and file for comment on policies such as this. We just simply made the policy and said, here, you're going to do it. But this time, we involved the public, we involved the rank and file officers. And I was amazed at the press conference the other day when we rolled it out. One of our most harshest critics, community activists, actually stood up at the press conference with us to applaud us on it. And that let me know we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. She was elected in November of 2016. We're very thankful that you are here today. State's Attorney Kim Foxx. So you've been in office for a little over 6 months, but you have extensive, how many?
5, just 5.
Was it 5?
Don't
Sorry.
rush her, don't rush her.
We've given you more experience than you deserve, right? 5 months. 5 months, but you have extensive experience from the State's Attorney's Office being there beforehand. How does the State's Attorney's Office see this situation that you've inherited in the city, you know, post Laquan McDonald, post DOJ? Well, you were, the DOJ report came out very shortly after you took office. How are you taking what's happened during these two big events for our city, which are very significant in terms of how we police? How is the State's Attorney's Office, you know, prosecuting cases not only for citizens but also police, and what are you doing in order to continue to bridge that gap of trust?
Thank you. I think first and foremost, we've taken the time to listen over the course of the past 5.5 months. Having been elected in a time of really crisis, both on the violence front and the crisis of confidence in law enforcement, and it didn't just extend to the police department, it extended to the State's Attorney's Office. When we were talking about what happened around the McDonald case, it wasn't just that this young man was shot, it was the amount of time that it took for a decision to be made, and the heightened scrutiny of the State's Attorney's Office demonstrated that the public demanded accountability and answers from the prosecutor. And I think historically in conversations around the relationship between law enforcement and the community, it stopped with police and not with prosecutors. What's really important in this conversation is a lot of the people that are victims in the statistics that were outlined before we began of people who have been shot before, the people who were shot, they're victims, and then they engage in other behaviors and then become defendants. And so this cycle of victims and defendants, we see them, we touch them, and the legitimacy of what we're trying to do as law enforcement, as prosecutors, is the recognition that our victims and defendants are the same people and they come from the same neighborhoods. And so there was, and I say prosecutors, not just here, but I think across the country, is there's this sanctimonious, we fight on behalf of victims, and there's this image of who a victim is. And what we don't recognize are that the victims are defendants and their communities as a whole. And that's the conversation that I've been having with the public, is this notion that we haven't really paid attention to victimization in all of its forms, and whether that's also at the hands of police, and how we talk about it, that there's an entrenchment that comes when we talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is race, which is class, which is poverty, which is violence. And so for me, you ask how have we been dealing with that? One, we go to community and we acknowledge some of the failings that have happened with the system. Because whatever policy we try to implement, if you're trying to be a good partner with community without acknowledging to the community the failures that have happened before, they will never get to the point of not checking your phone on your way out for the cheating husband. I love that analogy. And maybe they won't ever fully trust you, but that relationship, that historical perspective, if you come into the room and say, well, I'm different, that didn't happen to me, why should I own what somebody else did? They're not gonna trust you. Very quickly, I tell the story of my grandmother, who for many years would not go to the doctor. And we asked her, why won't you go to the doctor? And she went back decades and talked about how back in the 40s, in the South, they were not treating African-American patients and in fact injecting them with syphilis to do trials. And this was 1995. I said, well, what does that got to do with you? And that history of distrust based on past actions influenced generations who came after and how they perceived getting medical treatment. So when you talk about serving and protecting and being in law enforcement and you don't acknowledge that the very people who need to trust you don't believe you because of something that happened decades ago, if you don't acknowledge that, we're not going to get there. And so for my limited tenure, it has been more about listening in community, not prescribing to community. It's about saying, what is it that we need to do better? How do we treat everyone along the continuum? How do we talk about reform and safety at the same time and not that they're antithetical? How do we change the narrative in terms of, I don't take it personally when someone says I don't trust prosecutors? I'm more driven by the fact that we have more underreported crime. We can talk about the homicide statistics because we can find them. There are bodies that are associated with that. But the number of victims who do not report crime because they do not trust the criminal justice system and they do not trust the prosecutor's office, I take that very personally. So that means that we engage in a relationship not just with the community, but with law enforcement. Superintendent Johnson and I have met on many occasions since I've gotten into office, talking about ways that we can better engage with the community. And you have to do that before there is a body on the ground. You have to do that before there's a tape to be released. You have to have that relationship building before crisis occurs, because trying to explain yourself in the aftermath is way too late.
Thank you. Before I go to Alderman Sawyer, I want this panel, before you all leave today, and this is for you too, Superintendent Johnson. I think your timing is 10 o'clock? Yep. So we're going to get to you before 10 o'clock. I want you to think of one thing. What is your wish for a policy, law, or regulation that is not in place that you would want to see that would make this a safer city, safer community? Because you have many people out here who want to hear what it is that they can all do, that they may have influence in doing that maybe we don't, that they could be stakeholders in making this a better place. So Alderman Roderick Sawyer, He is the 6th Ward Alderman, and he encompasses some of the neighborhoods that unfortunately have become infamous, known as the South Side, the Englewood neighborhoods. His community encompasses some of the most at-risk population in the city, not only in terms of color, but also of age, our at-risk youth. He is a member of the City Council Finance and Budget Operation. Alderman Sawyer, we had such a great discussion last night when we met for dinner, and there is so much going on, but recently I want to bring this issue to light because you have made headlines in the past week over an issue that was brought up with regard to emails and text messages that were uncovered in the City of Chicago Water Department that were actually transmitted also to the Chicago Police Department. How is it that you focus on this from a bird's eye view, being in the legislative branch of government? How is it that you can see what opportunity do we have to change this culture that we have, that State's Attorney Kim Foxx alluded to, that is really devastating the neighborhoods? How do we root out this culture? How many generations does it have to take before we're done with this?
Thank you, Tony, and I really appreciate it. That's a difficult question because we're talking about decades, generations of institutional racism that's been going on, not just in the police department, like you said, in the water department, various agencies in the city of Chicago and the county of Cook. Until we, again, address that, and I think it goes back to what Pamela stated in the beginning, that elephant in the room. We're always dancing around that same question. It comes down to race and trust and the ability for us to talk about these things on both sides of this issue. Until we can really have that type of dialogue and ask those uncomfortable questions, not just to white people, black people as well. We have a come to Jesus type of moment sometimes that we have to have with ourselves. And again, it is an uncomfortable conversation because what happens, like Dan stated earlier, 80% of the homicides are occurring in black neighborhoods, even though we're 1/3 of the population. That's a difficult conversation to have with black people. You know, we could easily, put it on the police and say the police shot someone. Let's be honest, that doesn't happen that often. When it happens, of course, it's horrible. We don't want that to happen, but that's not the bulk of our shootings. That's not the bulk of our problem. And again, we kind of dance around that. We also dance around the fact that when we show a homicide on TV, if you ever looked around the neighborhoods, for the most part, those neighborhoods are also those same neighborhoods that have disinvestment, lack of opportunity, economic opportunity. We don't see that. We tend not to see that. But that's an easy fix. I know it sounds easy, it's a long process, but until we start investing in our neighborhoods, until we start doing real resource allocation in the neighborhoods of need, which particularly happen to be on the south and west side, we're going to continue to have this conversation. We're going to continue to try to say that we can solve it, but we can't. But the fix is there in front of our eyes. Put some investment in our neighborhoods. Show some that we trust and appreciate our young people. One other thing that I will say is one of the big problems that we have, particularly with our youth, it really, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but our youth don't have love in their lives. There's no one, if you take the room here today, we've been cultured and we've been, appreciated by our parents and disciplined. You've shown some interest in your children and you are shown interest in by your parents. We're dealing with a group of young individuals on the street right now that they're either from the foster system or they're from parents that really have a disconnect with their children. So they look to the street for that love and attention. And they're getting it from drug dealers, from criminals.
The wrong people.
The wrong type of people. They're seeking love and attention and some structure in their lives, but they're getting it from the wrong individuals right now. We're the ones that have to step up and provide that love and attention and that good feeling and that opportunity. Hey, you need a job. You need to get trained up. You need to go here. Okay, you don't want to go to college, but there's some training programs here. You have a driver's license. Let me help you get that, you know, because that's what's necessary for you to get a job. You're on drugs. You need to get into a program. We need to get you off so that we can get you that opportunity to get a job. We always talk about the availability of jobs. There are a lot of jobs in the greater Chicagoland area. We just don't have people trained up to get them right now, and we need to make that connection. And I put that incumbent upon me and other members of the city council to help with that. That's our task to try to help with, to solve this bigger problem. So,
Well, I have my own wish, and I'm going to tell you what my
All right.
wish is. But I want to know, before Superintendent Johnson leaves, what commitment do you, as an alderman, and the city council have towards giving the Chicago Police Department the money it needs in order to train the officers in the manner in which they can respect the community and know that the community
Absolutely.
has that trust back?
I'm no a secret that I'm a big fan and continue to be a big fan of Superintendent Johnson's. And when I talk to people and when we come to budget time, I'm always a big proponent of making sure that we can allocate a full complement of police officers. I'm not saying that more police officers are going to solve crime, but it is true if we don't have the full complement of police officers to respond to things like 911 calls. You know, you hear those complaints. I put in a 911 call, it took 2 hours for a police officer to come. We're not staffed up enough. We don't have the officer-friendly program like we used to have when we were kids. We're not staffed up enough. We don't have beat officers walking beats. We're not staffed up enough. And Superintendent Johnson has stated that from the very beginning. And it's not a solution to crime. It's just making sure that he has all the tools necessary to do his job.
Superintendent Johnson, what is your wish before you leave? I know that you have other commitments, so what is your wish?
It's funny you should ask. So I actually have two wishes. The alderman alluded to one of them already. Listen, the simple fact of it is more policemen won't solve the violence issue, but it is a piece of it. You know, and some of the things that we need to do, you just simply can't have law enforcement on the cheap. You're either going to pay on the front end or you're going to pay on the back end. Right. And training is so important to ensure that the police officers that are out there do the job correctly. You know, in the history of law enforcement and in CPD, we've never really invested in the physical and mental wellness of the officers. And if we invest in those two things, they will be 100% when they have to go out there in the community and interact with the community, because the CPD has to be a part of the community. We have to be. We're only as strong as the faith that the community have in us. So to that end, that's one of my wishes, to ensure, and the mayor has been really good with providing those resources, and I hope, Alderman, that continues, that we'll continue to get those resources. But the second wish that I have is my goal. You know, every morning I wake up and I look in the mirror, I'm African American, right? That's not going to change. I am not a fan of incarcerating more minority African American people. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to create a culture in this city where people won't want to pick up a firearm and use it. And we can fix that. We can create that culture. You create it by holding people accountable, but you also create it by more economic support in those impoverished neighborhoods, better mental health care, better education, teaching people how to be parents. Because when you have kids having kids, they don't know how to raise that child. And trust me when I tell you, I think it was the alderman that touched on this about kids needing love. I spoke to a group of about 40 young men and women a couple of months ago, African American and Hispanic. For those 40 individuals, male and female, to sit there and tell the police superintendent that they had engaged in violent crime, shooting people and robbing people, I thought was amazing on their part. It took a lot of courage for them to tell me that. But I will tell you all this before I leave. I asked each one of them, what was it that made you change your life around? And you know what they told me? Somebody reached out and touched them and said, I care about what you are doing to yourself and the people around you. I care enough about you to point you in the right direction. That's what changed them around. So you telling me we can't do that? The answer is we can. We just have to have the will to do it. So those are my two wishes, if we can get that done. You know, the political will to hold people accountable, but also to provide that support that folks are looking for, because that's critical to this conversation. And the last thing I would tell you all for CPD is transforming. We're changing. And in order to change, I said it from the first day I became superintendent. I think Kim Foxx said it best. You have to acknowledge when you've done things incorrectly, talk about it, and then fix it. Because if you don't acknowledge it, you never have an opportunity to fix it. And you know, a lot of people in the African American communities, they historically haven't had trust for the police department, but more importantly, they haven't had trust for particular police officers. And we have to change that narrative, you know. So the police department, we have to understand we're not enforcers of the community, we're part of the community. And I think we're getting there. And this last year, I didn't think I would see it this quickly, but people ask me about the clearance rate. And I tell people all the time, it's not a CPD clearance rate, it's a Chicago clearance rate. And what I mean by that is that we need the community to give us the information we need so that we can present the case to the state's attorney to bring people that commit crimes to justice. And I've seen in the last 6 months, the community is starting to step up and give us the information we need. So we're heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot more work to be done. But I appreciate you all inviting me here today.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. We're not done. The rest of them are not off the hook yet. My next question, or my next topic, because it's senseless to talk about violence in the city of Chicago unless we talk about the instrument that is probably 90% of the cause of violence in the city, and those are guns. And not only are there guns now, but we've seen that, especially just in the past several weeks, we've seen that there are use of, you know, assault weapons and high-powered rifles being used on unsuspecting people and people who are involved in gang warfare. And I know that Dan and I were talking about the issue. I mean, the day of even the 9mm or the Saturday night special being used on the street is just inconsequential, because that's not enough firepower for people who want to do nefarious things with guns. So the discussion now turns to guns. We will fail at the federal level in changing our gun laws. We're not going to see a change in the Second Amendment. We're not going to see a change, very likely, under this administration in how guns are dealt and sold and distributed. But I believe the state has an opportunity to do something about it that the federal government does not. How do you, State's Attorney Kim Foxx, see this issue being dealt with not only on a local level, but hopefully a state level, where we can get gun control under some better form of control?
Certainly. So there's legislation down in Springfield around gun licensing to look at some of our gun dealers who have, you know, abided by the letter of the law, if not the color, in terms of those who are coming in and engaging in straw purchasing. And that is legislation that I think has passed the Senate and is in the House, and we will see where its fate goes. I think from a local standpoint, when we talk about gun violence in the city, again, we generally talk about it after the trigger has been pulled. One of the statistics that I find extremely troubling is that in addition to the homicide rate being more than that of New York and LA combined, the number of guns that we take off the street in the city of Chicago is more than New York and Los Angeles combined times 2. That's how many guns we take off the street. So we have two competing issues going on. One is the use of illegal firearms, and the other is the proliferation of illegal firearms in disadvantaged neighborhoods. You know, one of the things that I think is always important to share with groups is that it's easier for young people in certain neighborhoods to get a gun than it is for them to get treatment for the trauma of having witnessed someone been shot. When we talk about what's happening, it's the deadly mix of the accessibility of guns in communities that are besieged by trauma, and the belief that for many, it's better to have a gun in these neighborhoods than to not have one. So as we try to talk about, you know, how do we change the culture where you're saying we don't want you to pick up a gun, the fear of consequences, the consequences for some, they are less fearful of going to prison than they are of being killed. And so for us, it means we've come up with a gun strategies unit in our office that didn't exist before, where we have some of our top prosecutors who are out in the community in the 7th and 11th Police District, the Inglewood and Harrison districts, where they are on the ground working with the police department as well as our federal partners in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the DEA, the ATF, and the U.S. Marshal's Office. And they are working on building cases, again, off of those who are driving the most violence and are using guns to do that. They are then taking those cases, and what we're doing now is we're doing vertical prosecutions. So of those cases, you know, they file them, and they're the same prosecutor who follows that case all the way through. We believe, and we've seen some positive showings out of the 7th and 11th districts as it relates to gun crimes since we've been there in February, that it has an impact. But I think we have to talk strategically about the proliferation, the trafficking of guns, and the use of guns, and be more creative. The fact that the State's Attorney's Office did not have a gun trafficking unit prior to my getting there was astounding to me, particularly because of the number of guns that we have. And so it's not even a matter, you know, people are always saying, well, we need to enhance the laws and change laws. Is we have laws on the books, but we haven't scrutinized, we haven't used the data to determine, are we being effective in how we're using them? Are we bringing the full force of the office to bear to do that, rather than adding on? And so that's what we're doing. We're working on both trafficking and the use of guns, and being more proactive, getting out into the community, getting real-time intelligence, building stronger cases so that we have stronger prosecutions in the end.
Pam and Alderman Sawyer, do you feel that Chicago is geographically doomed? Because, I mean, let's say that we are strong in our trafficking laws, but so what if we have a pipeline from Indiana and Wisconsin and from other states, you know, bringing the guns in freely? Because my understanding is that most of our guns come from out of state. They don't come from Illinois. Is that correct? I mean, am I right on that, Alderman Sawyer? Pam, if you can answer that, or anybody in the audience can.
Yes, that's actually correct, and I think Foxx will attest to that. But I think she hit on a key point, and this is where we can get involved, is why individuals feel they need guns. And sometimes they feel they need them to protect themselves. So you have to go back to the economic disparities, the inequality in education, and the fear of just being black while walking or driving, or being brown and walking and driving. And I think if we don't deal with those issues, last night I was talking to Judge Burke, and you guys know she's adopted an African-American son. And she said her husband said to her son, if you go without alcohol for 21 years, we'll give you a car. And he did it. And on that day, she called, they called the car, and she didn't know I was going to use her story, but I think it's a great story. They call the car dealership and say, our son is going to come down, he's going to get a car, and this is what he's looking for. When the dealer saw that their son was African American, he wanted a Ford Ranger. He called them back and said, look, he's a black man. If I get him a Ford Ranger, the sound on it is loud, it's going to be humming, he's going to be driving with glasses on, somebody's going to pull him over, and he could be shot. When a car dealer is telling a judge that that's the reality for her son, that's the reality. And there are some individuals that feel that if they aren't packing, that they won't be able to protect themselves. So as a community, I think, one, we have to get on the telephone, because I do think it's imperative that the gun law that is before the House gets passed. And we have to put more pressures on the individuals that we send to the state to pass the laws. They don't. We don't work for them, they work for us. And we have to make it very clear that pink slips exist, both in the legislation, both on the police force, that just as we hired you, we can fire you if you don't do what it is we want. We have to engage, and we have to say, pass the law that's gonna restrict even those individuals with mental conditions who are able to get guns. But number two, let's in the community engage so that we can deal with the real issue about why it is someone would go to Indiana to get a gun to protect themselves in a community where they feel like if they don't have one, as Kim said, death is the greater end. And that's the issue. So I think, are you doomed? You're doomed if you don't deal with that issue.
Right.
And you try to deal with a piece of the issue. And sometimes we become satisfied with dealing with pieces of the issue instead of seeing the problem as complicated and complex. So it's not just that Indiana is flooding you guys, because that's easy for you to be off the hook with. It is that we are not doing our jobs. You know, Hillary Clinton wrote a book, It Takes a Village. That's not a concept she created. We've been knowing that for years. The parent next door could whip you. Can't do that anymore. And we have to engage again where we make people understand that responsibility and freedom go hand in hand.
Alderman Sawyer, if you could follow up with that, and then I'd also like you to discuss, because you are the alderman in Englewood, and I know you spend a lot of time there with your community, can you tell us what your community is telling you? Because so many of the people there are, 99%, are not violent. They're good.
That's right.
And what is it that they are asking you to do that you just can't get to that needs to be done? So if you could take those two, the gun issue and then the community issue, please.
Yes, I'd like to follow up with Pam, because I agree with her 100%. But furthermore, young individuals, and I've had plenty of opportunity to talk with young brothers and sisters on the street, they feel a certain sense of empowerment when they have that gun. You know, because they've been disenfranchised for so long, they feel that there's no other opportunity that exists for them but through the power of that pistol or that they have. So it's very easy for them to get a gun, as was stated earlier today. They don't have to go to Indiana to get guns. Guns are brought to them where they are, and every day. We all know that. That's the worst kept secret in the world. They can get a gun easier than getting gum at the corner store right now, and they're getting them. I'm talking about gentlemen that have limited means, but can get a gun with a laser sight, a 30 round clip. Because you know, I know this is part of the next one of the future summits today, but they're on social media. They got all these guns, but they're struggling to eat. How can they get a $3,000 gun, you know, brought to their neighborhoods? And that's part of the problem. But that's the part that bringing them in from other states, we can't necessarily control from our local level. But we can do is find alternatives for them. I was with a gentleman the other day. He's part of a manufacturing program. And he was telling a story just like this. A guy he was a hitter. He was a shooter. You know, they got him in the manufacturing program. They got him through. He got a job. He's making $30, $40 an hour. The guy, they re-up, met with him again about 6 months later. Guns, he said he hasn't touched a gun. He has nothing to do with the gun. He bought a house. Now he's trying to buy a building. You know, his thing is now investing in real estate. He's like, I'll put that behind me. That life is over. I got something that's tangible right now. I don't want to ever touch a gun again. That's not my life anymore. And we have to do more of that to the young brothers and sisters that are on the street right now. We have to give them that other opportunity. Nobody wants to sit out there because you always got to turn your back. It's a rough life talking to these young brothers and sisters because they're always, when they're talking to you, they're always like this. Because they're constantly concerned about what could be coming at them that's the unknown. So until we give them that viable opportunity, again, we'll continue to have these roundabout conversations and we won't get anything done.
And what is it that you're hearing from the community that they want?
Again, and that goes back to, you asked a question earlier about what would be my wish.
Yeah, tell us what your
My
wish
wish is what my constituents are asking for, and I think that it occurred maybe 30 years ago. We once had a program in the city of Chicago that, for lack of a better term, we called it link development. So when we did something, you know, our downtown is beautiful. We have one of the best downtowns in the world. But what we don't have and we're missing are the same types of developments that are in our south and west side neighborhoods. So that if it was my drugs, and I think my neighbors would agree to this, if they build something, if they build a restaurant downtown, we're asking to build a similar type restaurant south or west side. If they're going to build a manufacturing center in the corridors down near north, we want them to do the same thing on the west side. If they're going to give us retail down here, we're usually some of the biggest shoppers. African Americans are some of the biggest consumers of these stores downtown. Why don't you just put the stores south and the west sides so that we can support our own and increase our tax bases and improve our neighborhoods and get jobs and all the things that accompany that. You know, if I get a job, I can buy a house. I buy a house, I'm a taxpayer. If I'm a taxpayer, I can buy goods and services. It goes on, and we can regenerate our communities naturally instead of waiting for handouts or, alms, so to speak. We want to make sure that we can control our destiny like everyone else. We eat like everyone else. We shop like everyone else. Give us that opportunity.
Well, one of the things that I've always talked about is, for example, I use the river walk as a great example. How beautiful is the river walk, right? It's beautiful, it's gorgeous. I use it. My office building is across the street from it. I get to see it every day. It's a $100 million project, and it's brought in tourism. It's brought in tax dollars. But the problem is that when we continually spend money, when we start centrally focused from the loop, it's what we were talking about last night. If we use City Hall as the center of the universe and we spread our money out from downtown Chicago and out, what happens at a certain point geographically in the city? It stops. There's like a roadblock where it stops. So my wish for you, Alderman, and for anybody who can do anything about it is we need to start diverting development from the Fulton Markets and the River Norths and the South Loops into the fringes and bring it in. Because once we do that, what are we going to do? We're going to employ people. We're going to have more money to spend in the neighborhoods. The tax dollars will increase, and people won't move. Right. We're going to reverse that trend. So we have some questions, and I want to get to those questions, and I also want to get to your two wishes, because we're not going to let you leave without putting your Christmas tree wish out there beforehand. But I do want to get to a couple of these questions. And one of them is for State's Attorney Kim Foxx. When you read about a 14-year-old shooting and talking, when I read about a 14-year-old shooting and talking about someone such as the shooting of Danny Davis's nephew, I look for a follow-up story to see whether the person who gave the youth the gun has been identified and prosecuted. Should this not be a priority?
That's an excellent question. It
is.
absolutely should be. I mean, that's the point I was making earlier. We have stopped, once we get the gun, we're glad that we got the gun, but we're not asking who's putting guns in the hands of 14-year-olds. The proliferation of guns and the accessibility of guns, particularly for young people, if you're looking at the statistics that were relayed earlier, these are not people who are going out to Indiana to get them. There are people who are profiting off of the illegal gun trade, but our resources have not been spent on going after the profiteers. We go after the end user. It's the same thing when we were dealing with the proliferation of drugs in public housing back in the 70s and 80s. They weren't bringing the drugs in themselves, they were getting them. But when our efforts and resources, both on the state and federal level, aren't going after those who are trafficking in this, we're gonna suffer. Just a quick piggyback off of that, you ask about the iron pipeline from Indiana to Illinois. New York had the same issue from guns that were coming. They have some of the strictest gun laws in the country, and their guns were coming up from the South, from Georgia, from Tennessee. They formed partnerships with their federal partners to impose sanctions that were strong and swift, even in states that they didn't have control over. That level of innovation is what is necessary here.
Do we need to go there?
We absolutely. Superintendent Johnson and I were just at a conference in New York about a month ago, looking at other strategies, other best practices that have occurred in other places to do that. But I think this kind of resolve that we have of, oh, we just get them from Indiana, this is an all-hands-on-deck proposition here for those where we get them from Indiana, from those where we have licensing issues, but also really being is innovative about not just having a gun and glad that it's gone, but tracing that gun and making sure that we're getting to the source of those who are supplying guns in these neighborhoods.
Thank you. Pam, I'm going to direct this next question to you. How much of police-citizen confrontation problem is due to a rise in resisting arrest by citizens?
Man, that's hard to say because, you know, we don't keep statistics. That's one of the things that should be done, but we don't have a database of statistics that would be able to attest to that. What we have found, and I know we'll deal with this in the social media panel, is that on social media, what you will see is that a lot of the police misconduct that occurs is not from individuals resisting arrest. You know, we find individuals that are shot because it looked like they're reaching for their guns, or they may slightly turn a different way. It's hard for us to judge even in Chicago because there's always one version of a story until you actually see the tape. And then on the tape, there's another version of the story. So I think when someone tries to codify that and say how much comes from individuals resisting arrest, you don't know. But here's what we did in the National Bar Association. We knew that there was a measure of individuals who may be resisting arrest and not understand how officers are trained. So in the 25 states that we selected to actually do our open records request and a focus on police brutality, we went to those cities and did training called Know Your Rights, because it could save your life. And we educated the community on things that they should not do. We brought in the police, prosecutors, public defenders, and we brought in individuals that represent, and we gave them little cards of what their constitutional rights were. But at the same time, we said when a police officer stops you, he's trained to hit you in the part of your mass that's gonna take you down. He's not trained to tase you. He's trained to hit you in this part. So therefore, when he stops you, don't move. If he pulls you over, keep your hands on the wheel. Don't make a gesture. Ask if you can do everything it is you want to do. We run down the rights, and we sometimes had to educate people that you can still do all of that, and still get shot.
And we could probably have a whole nother discussion on why people run from the police and what you're talking about, because that is so important. I mean, education is so important overall on both sides of the table. I have one more question, because there's another question that I would love the answer to, but Superintendent Johnson is not here, and that's what changes in the FOP contract would be essential. But he's not here to answer that, and I'm going to keep this card because we're not going to let that go unanswered, certainly for the second summit. This next one and last one, and then we're going to talk about our two wishes, and then it'll be time for me to leave the podium and bring up our next panel. But Alderman Sawyer, if you could answer this question within about a minute or two, and then we can talk about our wish list, and then I'll thank everyone. How do we prevent the effort to bring economic development to South and West Side communities from simply becoming gentrification like what occurred in Cabrini Green? And the person identified himself on the card, if I may. I think it's helpful. May I do that? Thank you.
All right.
And that's from Victor Dixon, the Safer Foundation.
Yes. That's an excellent question. Our constant push, obviously, is for economic development on our south and west sides. And it's not that we're anti-inclusion, and I'll say that. We want everybody to be a part of our respective neighborhoods. I happen to represent a neighborhood, my ward is 98% or so black. You know, not to say that we don't want other individuals moving in there, but I do want to maintain the character of our respective neighborhood, and I want to make sure that we provide resources. Because it's funny that you mentioned that. I had this conversation with someone the other day, and they laughed at me. I was talking to somebody about bringing a sushi restaurant to my community. And they laughed. They said, you know, black folks don't like sushi. I said, no, you're wrong. Go to any sushi restaurant in the city of Chicago. You'll see a whole lot of black people eating sushi.
You got that right.
You know, it's, We like what everyone else likes. Just
Yes,
like
we do.
you like soul food, I like sushi, I like comfort food, I like deli food, I like all the things that you would want to have in your neighborhood. I just don't want to have to travel downtown to another neighborhood to get it. That's all. So when you ask for these variety of things, neighbors they don't want to have to drive to Orland Park, downtown, Lincoln Park, to go get things that they should be able to get within 5 minutes of their respective homes. My mantra when I tell people this, my goal is for us to be able to walk out of our houses, go get goods and services, entertain yourselves, and be able to walk back home without incident. That's the goal for my community. So whoever's there, it's not, I'm not saying that's not important, but it's important that we have that type of community and that type of engagement where we all can have all the things necessary, whether it's a good steak restaurant, whether it's a family-style restaurant, whether it's a sports bar with that kicktail hamburger that you always want. We want all those things that all other neighborhoods have. That's all we want. We want that same type of equality. We're not asking for anything from you. We want you to help us provide the development for our respective neighborhoods so that we can do those same things within walking distance or a short driving distance of our homes. That's all.
Pam, what's your wish?
So here's my wish. When I became president of the National Bar Association, I became president 8 days before Mike Brown got shot. A lot of people think that we launched our police brutality initiative in response to him. We did not. We launched it when I became president. And we looked at 25 states and with the highest crime rate. And 25 locations so that we could report them to the Justice Department. So here's my wish. I wish that the Chicago Bar Association and lawyers in the Chicago area would use their legal skills to help and do things that are practical that can happen right now. So one of the things we did, and Chicago was on our list and Illinois was on our list, and what we did was send an open records request to every police department so that we could gather the data, because the Justice Department can't open a case to look at and inspect a police department unless they have some facts. We analyzed that information, compiled it, and gave it to the Attorney General. I don't trust that Sessions going to do that, but let's put the data in front of them as it relates to Chicago. Number two, I wish that you would take the knowledge that you have, go into the schools and do know your right training with children. Teach them, give them their constitutional rights on a card that they can put in their pocket, that they could take to the window sills of their cars. And third, I wish that you would help to, and we drafted it in the National Bar, take it, own it, ask that laws be passed on a local level, and that is a law for stricter adherence to mental health testing, detailed and thorough diversity training, and de-escalation of force training. And that's the reason I was shaking my head at the superintendent, because while he put that out, that's not a law. The city council needs to do that, and each little small municipality in this area that call themselves Chicago, but really are not Chicago, needs to pass that law. I have a copy of the law right here that we gave to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. You can have it and say, University Chicago Bar, that you drafted it. I really don't care. On a state level, to restore trust, advocate that there be a law established for independent police investigation and independent prosecution body. When the prosecutor and the police department are hand to hand and those are their witnesses, sometimes people don't trust that the prosecutor, even though they like him, is going to do an independent job to get it right. So independence yields trust. But on the federal level, and the superintendent's laws are great, but can you do me a favor and tell your state senators and your U.S. representatives that they must pass a law that overturns Tennessee versus Gardner? Because the standard is that a police officer can use that measure of force that he or she believes is reasonable to stop the force that he or she perceives. That's called discretion. And as long as that is present, we will hear officers say, I think he had a gun. I think he was reaching for a gun. I thought he was going to shoot me. I thought he was coming after me, because the law under Tennessee versus Gardner says if you think it, so it is. So have your Congress people, especially if they sit on the Judiciary Committee, to pass a law that has a succinct definition and training to escalation of force, and a succinct definition and training to escalation, de-escalation, and escalation of force. If we do that, then a standard and the trust would happen. That's what we can do as lawyers. That's the expertise we have.
Thank you,
the law.
Pam. And Kim, in 1 minute, if you can, summarize your wish.
Certainly. I go back to, we need to talk about justice reform in the same sentence that we talk about public safety. The narrative around why reform is necessary is because it keeps our community safer. And I think from the legal community, I think we have the ability to go out front on these issues and say that when we talk about intervention and prevention for young people, it keeps our community safer, that the acknowledgement that the gap between the community and law enforcement is what keeps our communities fragile. It's why the relationship continues to be frictious. But we have to acknowledge that and then invest in that. I think we spend a lot of money on the incarceration state. We spend very little money on the intervention and prevention state, and we have to do that. And so, in my dream world, we'd have reallocation of dollars from our criminal justice system, not just on incarceration, whether at our county jail, where we're looking at bond reform because we have a lot of nonviolent people who are there. We're spending our resources going after nonviolent offenders where our streets rage with violence, and very little in terms of expansion for diversion or intervention programs, trauma-informed services, things that people feel are touchy-feely that lawyers don't want to engage with. These are proven methods that work to drive down violence. We need to have that conversation from a legal perspective, that we have to be able to be okay with acknowledging that there are other bodies outside of the law who know a lot about what drives violence, using that research, using that data, and using our dollars to invest in prevention models and not fall back on what we're comfortable with, which is incarceration.
Thank you. And I just want to say that I do have one more wish, and I don't want to leave until I wish that Mariam Ahmad and Jesse Ruiz and Lori Lightfoot and Gina DeBoni and Stephanie Stein and Jennifer McGuffin, that you please stay on the committee for all the great work that you guys have done in bringing this together and making it happen. So that's my last wish. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience, and we'll be around to take questions personally afterwards.